Close your eyes and imagine the perfect meal. For millions, maybe billions of people around the world, that meal includes pasta. A simple plate of spaghetti, a bowl of ramen, creamy fettuccine, delicate ravioli. But have you ever wondered where this ubiquitous food actually came from? Who invented it? How did it spread across the world? And why do we associate it so strongly with Italy when its origins are far more complex and mysterious? What if I told you that pasta might be older than the Roman Empire? That Marco Polo definitely didn't bring it back from China? That's a complete myth. That tomatoes and pasta only came together a few hundred years ago? And that the way we eat pasta today would be completely unrecognizable to someone from the Renaissance? Today, we're going on an epic journey through 5,000 years of culinary history. We'll travel from ancient China to medieval Sicily, from Renaissance Italy to immigrant communities in New York, and finally to the global phenomenon that pasta has become in the 21st century. This is the untold, surprising, and absolutely fascinating story of pasta, one of humanity's greatest culinary achievements. So grab a fork, maybe a plate of your favorite noodles, and let's dive in. Our story begins not in Italy, but in China, specifically in the Yellow River Valley about 4,000 years ago. But to understand how revolutionary this discovery was, we need to talk about what archaeologists actually found. In 2005, a team of archaeologists was excavating the Lajia site in northwestern China, an area that had been destroyed by a catastrophic earthquake and flood around 2000 BCE. When they lifted an overturned pottery bowl, they found something extraordinary, a tangle of yellowish noodles, perfectly preserved in the oxygen-free environment created by the disaster. These weren't just any noodles. Analysis revealed they were made from millet, specifically foxtail millet and broomcorn millet, which were the primary grain crops in northern China at the time. The noodles were thin, about 3 millimeters in diameter, and were remarkably similar in shape to the hand-pulled noodles, or lamian, still made in China today. This discovery pushed back the documented history of noodles by centuries, possibly millennia. But here's what's crucial to understand. These noodles represent not an invention, but a culmination. The people who made them had clearly been perfecting the technique for generations, maybe centuries. So the real origin of noodles is likely much, much older. To make noodles, you need a few things: domesticated grain crops, the technology to mill them into flour, and the knowledge to mix flour with water to create dough. All of these elements came together during the Neolithic Revolution, when humans transitioned from hunting and gathering to agriculture. This happened independently in several regions around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. In China, it was millet and rice. In the Middle East and Mediterranean, it was wheat and barley. In the Americas, it was corn. Each of these civilizations likely developed their own forms of flatbreads, doughs, and eventually noodles. Now let's jump westward to the ancient Mediterranean. The Greeks and Romans definitely had pasta-like foods, though they weren't quite what we'd recognize as pasta today. The ancient Greeks had something called laganan. The word itself comes from the Greek laganan, meaning a flat sheet of pasta dough cut into strips. The Greek poet Aristophanes mentioned something similar in his plays around 400 BCE. This was essentially fresh pasta dough that was boiled or baked. The Romans adopted this and called it laganum, and it appeared in the writings of several Roman authors. The famous Roman cookbook De Re Coquinaria, attributed to Apicius from the 1st century CE, includes recipes that call for layering laganum with other ingredients, basically an ancient ancestor of lasagna. But here's the key difference. These ancient pasta sheets weren't the dried, shelf-stable product we think of today. They were fresh, used immediately, and often baked rather than boiled. They were more like dumpling wrappers or flatbreads than modern pasta. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, something interesting was happening. The Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, compiled around the 3rd to 6th century CE, mentions something called itria, or itrium, a type of dough product that could be dried and stored. This is huge. This is possibly the first reference to dried pasta, which is a game changer. Fresh pasta is great, but dried pasta is revolutionary because it can be stored for months or even years, making it perfect for travel, trade, and military campaigns. By the 9th century, Arab geographers were writing extensively about itria. The famous geographer Al-Idrisi, writing in the 12th century, described a thriving industry in Sicily producing dried pasta. More on that in a moment. So here's what we know about ancient noodles. Multiple civilizations independently developed noodle-like foods. The Chinese were making millet noodles 4,000 years ago. The Greeks and Romans had laganum. Middle Eastern cultures developed dried pasta that could be stored and traded. These weren't the same thing. They had different ingredients, different techniques, different purposes. But they all shared a common thread: the realization that flour mixed with liquid and shaped into strands or sheets could become something delicious, nutritious, and versatile. Pasta wasn't invented. It evolved simultaneously across the ancient world. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room, or should I say the explorer in the Silk Road. You've probably heard the story. Marco Polo traveled to China in the 13th century, discovered noodles, brought them back to Italy, and boom, pasta was born. It's a great story. It's romantic. It connects East and West. There's just one problem: it's completely false. The Marco Polo myth is one of the most persistent legends in food history, and it's time we set the record straight. First, let's look at the timeline. Marco Polo traveled to China between 1271 and 1295, but we have documented evidence of pasta in Italy well before that. A document from 1279, while Marco Polo was still in China, mentions a basket of macaronis in the inventory of a deceased soldier in Genoa. Another document from 1244 references pasta regulations in the town of Salerno. So where did this myth come from? The story appears to have originated with the Macaroni Journal, published by an American pasta manufacturers association in the 1920s and 30s. They published a fictional story about Marco Polo, discovering pasta as a marketing tool to make pasta seem more exotic and interesting to American consumers. The story caught on because it was simple, memorable, and it gave pasta a clear origin story. But it's fiction, pure and simple. The real story of how pasta came to Italy is actually more interesting. It involves Arab traders, Sicilian sun, and the genius of preservation technology. In the 9th century CE, Arabs conquered Sicily and parts of southern Italy. They brought with them advanced agricultural techniques, new crops like citrus fruits and sugarcane, and yes, dried pasta. Remember that Etruria we talked about earlier? Arab traders brought it to Sicily, and the island turned out to be the perfect place for pasta production. Sicily has a hot, dry climate with consistent winds, ideal conditions for drying pasta. The wheat grown in Sicily was also perfect for pasta making, with high gluten content that creates the right texture. By the 12th century, Sicily had a thriving pasta export industry. The geographer Al-Idrisi, working at the court of King Roger II of Sicily, wrote about a town called Trabia, near Palermo, where they produced so much dried pasta that they shipped it throughout the Mediterranean to Christian and Muslim lands alike. This dried pasta, then called tria in Sicily, was revolutionary. It could last for months without spoiling, making it ideal for long sea voyages, military campaigns, and trade. It was lightweight, nutritious, and could be prepared simply by boiling it in water. So no, Marco Polo didn't bring pasta to Italy. Pasta arrived via Arab traders centuries before Marco Polo was born. It took root in Sicily because of the island's perfect climate and agricultural conditions, and it spread throughout Italy not because of one explorer's journey, but through the slow, organic process of cultural exchange, trade, and culinary innovation. The Marco Polo myth is a reminder that food history is often more complex and interconnected than simple origin stories suggest. And frankly, the real story of cultural exchange, technological innovation, and the movement of ideas across the Mediterranean is way more interesting than one guy bringing back noodles in his backpack. So pasta has arrived in Sicily through Arab traders in the 9th century. But how did it go from a Sicilian specialty to the defining staple of Italian cuisine? That transformation took centuries and involved economics, innovation, and a major shift in how Italians thought about food. Let's set the scene. Medieval Italy wasn't a unified country. It was a collection of independent city-states, kingdoms and republics, each with their own culinary traditions. Northern Italians ate rice, polenta and bread. Central Italians had their own traditions. Southern Italians, particularly in Sicily and Naples, ate pasta. For a long time, pasta was considered food for the poor, particularly in the south. It was cheap, filling, and could be stored indefinitely. Wealthy Italians preferred meat, game, elaborate pies, and other luxuries. Pasta was what peasants and workers ate. But several things happened between the 12th and 16th centuries that changed pasta's status and spread it throughout Italy. First, the technology of pasta making evolved. In the 13th and 14th centuries, pasta makers began experimenting with different shapes. They discovered that different shapes held sauces differently and created different eating experiences. Long strands like vermicelli and spaghetti appeared. Tubular shapes like macaroni were invented, likely inspired by the hollow reeds that grew in Sicily. Small shapes like ditalini and stelline were created for soups. Large sheets for layering became lasagne. This wasn't just about variety for its own sake. Each shape served a purpose. Thick, ridged shapes like rigatoni could hold chunky sauces. Delicate angel hair pasta paired well with light, oil-based sauces. Hollowed shapes trapped sauce inside, creating bursts of flavor with each bite. The development of bronze dies, molds that shaped pasta as it was extruded, was a major technological breakthrough. This allowed pasta makers to create consistent, uniform shapes in large quantities. The rough texture left by bronze dies also helped sauce cling better to the pasta. Second, pasta making became professionalized. By the 14th century, pasta makers in cities like Genoa, Naples, and Palermo had formed guilds, professional organizations that controlled production, set quality standards, and protected trade secrets. These guilds were serious business. In Genoa, the fideli, or vermicelli makers, had strict rules about ingredients, techniques, and apprenticeships. You couldn't just decide to become a pasta maker. You had to train for years and be accepted into the guild. This professionalization raised the status of pasta. It wasn't just peasant food anymore. It was a craft, an art form. Master pasta makers were respected artisans, and their products commanded premium prices. Third, pasta began appearing on wealthy tables. Renaissance cookbooks from the 14th and 15th centuries include increasingly elaborate pasta dishes. Pasta wasn't just boiled and eaten plain anymore. It was being dressed with butter, cheese, spices, and sweet ingredients. Wait, sweet ingredients? Yes, you heard that right. Medieval and Renaissance pasta dishes were often sweet. A popular dish called lasagna di menudelli combined pasta with sugar, cinnamon, and rosewater. Another recipe layered pasta with ground meat, dried fruits, and spices. This sounds strange to us now, but medieval European cuisine didn't have the same sharp distinction between sweet and savory that we have today. Meat dishes often included dried fruits and sugar. Savory and sweet flavors were meant to balance each other out. But the real turning point for pasta came in Naples in the 17th century. Naples became the pasta capital of the world, and Neapolitans became known as mangia macaroni, macaroni eaters. Why Naples? Several factors came together. Naples had a large, rapidly growing population of urban workers who needed cheap, filling food. The city had access to high-quality wheat from the surrounding countryside. The climate was perfect for drying pasta, and perhaps most importantly, Naples developed a unique street food culture around pasta. Street vendors called macaronari sold fresh pasta from outdoor stalls. They would boil enormous pots of pasta and serve it to customers on the street. And here's the fascinating part. People ate it with their hands. That's right. Before forks became common utensils, Neapolitans would take a handful of pasta, tilt their heads back, and lower the strands into their mouths. It was a spectacle, and it became associated with the image of Naples itself. Foreign visitors to Naples wrote about seeing crowds of people eating pasta this way, and artists painted scenes of these pasta vendors. This street food culture made pasta incredibly popular across all social classes in Naples. Poor workers ate it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Wealthy Neapolitans ate it at taverns and restaurants. Everyone in Naples ate pasta, all the time. By the 18th century, Naples was consuming staggering amounts of pasta. Estimates suggest that the average Neapolitan ate pasta at least once a day, if not twice. The city supported hundreds of pasta shops, factories, and street vendors. This huge demand drove innovation. Pasta makers developed new shapes, new sauces, new ways of serving and eating pasta. They invented the torchio, a screw press that could extrude pasta in various shapes. They perfected the art of drying pasta in large quantities while maintaining quality. The first real pasta cookbook appeared in 1773, written by Vincenzo Corrado, a chef at the royal court in Naples. It contained over 400 recipes, many featuring pasta. This wasn't peasant food anymore, this was haute cuisine. But even as pasta became more refined and sophisticated, it never lost its democratic character. Unlike French haute cuisine, which was exclusively for the wealthy, Italian pasta cuisine maintained a dual identity. It was food for everyone, from the poorest laborer to the richest nobleman. Different regions of Italy developed their own pasta traditions during this period. In Emilia-Romagna, they created filled pastas like tortellini and ravioli. In Liguria, they developed troffi and corzetti. In Sardinia, they made fregola and maloreddus. Each region used local ingredients, local techniques, and created shapes that reflected local traditions. By the end of the 18th century, pasta had become an essential part of Italian identity, particularly in the south. It was affordable, nutritious, versatile, and delicious. It could be dressed simply with olive oil and cheese, or elaborated with complex sauces. But there was still one crucial element missing, something that would transform pasta from a beloved regional food into the global icon we know today. And that element was growing in gardens across southern Italy, waiting for someone to realize its potential: the tomato. It's almost impossible to imagine Italian pasta without tomato sauce. Spaghetti marinara, pasta al pomodoro, amatriciana, arrabbiata. Tomatoes are as essential to Italian cuisine as pasta itself. But here's a fact that might shock you. For most of pasta's history in Italy, it was never served with tomatoes. The marriage of pasta and tomatoes is relatively recent, dating back only about 250 years. And the story of how they came together is a tale of global exploration, botanical confusion, and culinary courage. Let's start with the tomato itself. Tomatoes are native to western South America, probably originating in the region that's now Peru and Ecuador. The wild ancestor of the modern tomato was a small, cherry-sized fruit that grew on vines. Ancient peoples in South America and Mexico domesticated the tomato thousands of years ago. The Aztecs called it ixitomatl, which means roughly plump thing with a navel. They incorporated tomatoes into their cuisine, creating the first salsas and tomato-based sauces. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in the early 16th century, they encountered tomatoes and brought seeds back to Europe. The first tomatoes arrived in Spain probably around 1520, and from there they spread to Italy, France, and other European countries. But Europeans didn't know what to make of this strange new fruit. First of all, they recognized that tomatoes belonged to the nightshade family, which includes several poisonous plants like deadly nightshade and mandrake. This made people deeply suspicious of tomatoes. The tomato's resemblance to other nightshade plants, combined with the fact that tomato leaves and stems are actually mildly toxic, led to widespread fear. For decades, Europeans grew tomatoes as ornamental plants in their gardens, admiring them but never eating them. The earliest European references to tomatoes call them pomidoro, golden apples, in Italian, suggesting the first tomatoes to arrive were yellow varieties. The name tomato itself comes from the Spanish tomate, derived from the Aztec tomatl. The first documented recipe using tomatoes in Europe appeared in 1692 in a cookbook by Antonio Latini, a chef working in Naples. His cookbook Lo Scalco alla Moderna included a recipe for Spanish-style tomato sauce, essentially tomatoes cooked with onions, peppers, and herbs. But notice, this was a sauce served on its own, or with meat, not with pasta. It would be another century before anyone thought to put tomato sauce on pasta. Why did it take so long? Several reasons. First, the fear of tomatoes took generations to overcome. Second, early European tomatoes were very different from modern varieties. They were more acidic, more watery, and less sweet. They weren't immediately delicious. The breakthrough came, once again, in Naples in the late 18th century. Several factors came together to make Naples the birthplace of tomato pasta cuisine. First, Naples had a warm climate where tomatoes thrived. The volcanic soil around Mount Vesuvius produced especially flavorful tomatoes. By the mid-1700s, tomatoes were growing abundantly around Naples and becoming cheap and accessible to ordinary people. Second, Neapolitans were already pasta-obsessed. They were eating pasta every day and were constantly experimenting with new ways to dress it. Traditional toppings included cheese, olive oil, anchovies, and garlic. Tomatoes were a natural next step. Third, someone we don't know exactly who had the genius to realize that the acidity of tomatoes perfectly balanced the starchiness of pasta. It was a revelation. The combination was better than the sum of its parts. The first written reference to pasta with tomato sauce appeared in 1839 in a cookbook by Ippolito Cavalcanti, a Neapolitan duke. His recipe for vermicelli con le pomodoro directed readers to cook vermicelli and dress it with crushed tomatoes, basil, olive oil, and salt. This simple recipe, pasta al pomodoro, became the foundation of Neapolitan cuisine and eventually all of Italian cooking. It was democratic, delicious, and accessible. Anyone could make it. You didn't need expensive ingredients or complex techniques, just good pasta, ripe tomatoes, and a bit of olive oil. From this simple base, Neapolitan cooks began creating variations. They added garlic for extra flavor. They included anchovies for umami depth. They threw in some red pepper flakes for heat. They stirred in fresh mozzarella or aged parmesan. Classic Neapolitan pasta dishes emerged during the 19th century: pasta alla marinara, the sailor's pasta, made with tomatoes, garlic, olive oil, and oregano. Despite the name, it contains no seafood. Marinara refers to the fact that sailors' wives would make this quick sauce when their husbands returned from sea, using ingredients that kept well in the pantry. Pasta alla matriciana, from the town of Amatrice, made with tomato sauce, guanciale, cured pork jowl, pecorino romano cheese, and black pepper. This is a perfect example of how tomatoes enhanced traditional recipes. Earlier versions of amatriciana used butter or olive oil instead of tomatoes. Pasta alla puttanesca, the prostitute's pasta, made with tomatoes, olives, capers, anchovies, and garlic. The name's origin is disputed. Some say it was quick enough for prostitutes to make between clients. Others say it was flavorful enough to lure clients. Others claim it's named after its easy ingredients. Ragù napoletano, a slow-cooked tomato sauce with large pieces of meat, simmered for hours. This isn't the same as bolognese ragu. Neapolitan ragu is tomato-forward, while bolognese is meat-forward. But why do tomatoes and pasta work so well together? There's actually some food science here. Tomatoes are rich in glutamates, which create umami, that savory, satisfying flavor that makes food taste complete. When you combine the starchy, neutral flavor of pasta with the acidic, umami-rich flavor of tomatoes, you create a perfect balance. The pasta softens the tomatoes' acidity, while the tomatoes add depth and complexity to the pasta. Cooking tomatoes also enhances their flavor. Heat breaks down the tomatoes' cell walls and concentrates their sugars and acids. It also releases lycopene, a powerful antioxidant that gives tomatoes their red color and provides health benefits. The fat from olive oil helps carry tomato flavor and allows fat-soluble flavor compounds to be absorbed. It also helps the sauce coat the pasta more evenly. And the starchy pasta water, the pasta water, acts as an emulsifier, helping bind the sauce to the noodles. By the late 19th century, pasta with tomato sauce had become the quintessential Italian dish. It had conquered Naples, spread throughout southern Italy, and was beginning to appear in central and northern regions as well. And then, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, millions of Italians began emigrating to other countries, bringing their passion for pasta and tomatoes with them. Italian cuisine was about to go global. Between 1880 and 1920, over 4 million Italians emigrated to the United States. Millions more went to Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Australia, and other countries. They left Italy because of poverty, political instability, and the promise of better opportunities abroad. They brought almost nothing with them, just the clothes on their backs, a few personal possessions, and their culinary traditions. And those traditions would transform the food landscape of their new homes. When Italian immigrants arrived in American cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, they congregated in neighborhoods that became known as Little Italy. These weren't just residential areas. They were attempts to recreate Italy on foreign soil, complete with Italian markets, bakeries, restaurants, and social clubs. Food was central to maintaining Italian identity in a new and often hostile environment. Early Italian immigrants faced significant discrimination. They were considered racially inferior by many Americans, excluded from certain jobs and neighborhoods, and subjected to violence. Food became a way to preserve dignity, community, and connection to home. Italian immigrants opened groceries, selling imported pasta, canned tomatoes, olive oil, and cheese. When imported goods were too expensive, they started producing them locally. By the 1910s and 20s, Italian Americans were operating pasta factories, cheese-making operations, and canneries in cities across America. Some of these operations became huge success stories. The Ronzoni Pasta Company was founded in 1915 by an Italian immigrant in New York. Prince Pasta was founded in Boston in 19... These companies didn't just serve Italian-American communities, they introduced pasta to mainstream American consumers. Italian restaurants began opening in the late 19th century, initially serving only Italian customers. But gradually, non-Italian Americans began discovering Italian food. It was cheap, filling, and exotic enough to be interesting, but not so foreign as to be intimidating. The red and white checkered tablecloth, the straw-covered Chianti bottles with candles stuck in them, the mandolin music, these became the cliched symbols of Italian-American restaurants. They didn't exist in Italy, they were invented in America to create an authentic Italian atmosphere for non-Italian customers. And the food served in these restaurants? It was Italian, but it was also something new. Italian Americans adapted their traditional recipes to available ingredients and American tastes, creating what we now call Italian-American cuisine. Meat became much more prominent. In Italy, meat was expensive and eaten sparingly. In America, meat was relatively cheap, and Italian Americans who had eaten meat only on Sundays in Italy could now afford it regularly. Dishes became meatier, heartier, more abundant. Spaghetti and meatballs became the iconic Italian-American dish. In Italy, meatballs, polpetta, are eaten on their own or in soup, rarely with pasta. But in America, combining them with spaghetti created a complete, satisfying meal that became hugely popular. Other Italian-American classics emerged. Fettuccine Alfredo, created in Rome in 1914 by restaurateur Alfredo Di Lelio, but it only became famous after American honeymooners Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks ate at his restaurant and brought the recipe back to America. In Italy, it's just pasta with butter and parmesan. In America, it became a cream sauce, chicken parmesan, a variation on melanzane alla parmigiana, eggplant parmesan, but using chicken instead. It became a staple of Italian-American restaurants and eventually made its way back to Italy as Polo alla parmigiana, baked ziti. This exists in southern Italy, but Italian-Americans elevated it to a party staple, loaded with ricotta, mozzarella and meat sauce. Garlic bread. Italians do eat bread with olive oil and garlic, but the butter-soaked, heavily garliced, cheese-topped version is purely Italian-American. Caesar salad. Surprisingly, this was invented by an Italian immigrant in Mexico. Cesar Cardini created it in Tijuana in 1924, but it became associated with Italian-American restaurants. By the 1920s and 30s, pasta had entered mainstream American consciousness. Companies like Chef Boyardee, founded by Italian immigrant Hector Boiardi in 1928, began selling canned pasta products that could sit on shelves for months. These weren't authentic Italian dishes, but they introduced millions of Americans to pasta for the first time. The story of Chef Boyardee is particularly interesting. Hector Boiardi was a successful chef who ran a popular Italian restaurant in Cleveland. His customers loved his food so much that they wanted to take it home. He started selling bottled sauces and pasta kits from his restaurant, and demand grew so large that he opened a factory. During World War II, his company produced millions of rations for Allied troops. The Great Depression and World War II actually helped pasta's popularity. It was cheap, shelf-stable and filling, perfect for hard times. The US government even promoted pasta as part of a healthy, economical diet. World War II was a turning point for Italian food in America. American soldiers stationed in Italy fell in love with Italian cuisine. When they returned home after the war, they had a craving for the food they'd eaten overseas. This created unprecedented demand for Italian restaurants and Italian ingredients. The GI Bill helped many returning veterans, including Italian Americans, start businesses. Italian restaurants opened in suburbs across America, not just in urban Italian neighborhoods. Pizza parlors, which had been rare before the war, suddenly appeared everywhere. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s and 60s coincided with a growing interest in international cuisines. Italian restaurants moved from immigrant neighborhoods into suburbs and shopping centers. Pasta went from ethnic food to mainstream American staple. Television played a role too. Cooking shows featuring Italian cuisine appeared on TV. Julia Child, though known for French cooking, occasionally featured Italian dishes. The Italian chef Ettore Boiardi appeared in commercials promoting his products. The same pattern repeated in other countries with significant Italian immigration. In Argentina, which received over 2 million Italian immigrants between 1880–50, Italian cuisine became deeply integrated into Argentine food culture. Pizza, pasta, and gelato are as Argentine as empanadas. Buenos Aires has neighborhoods that are more Italian than many cities in Italy. Argentine pasta dishes developed their own character. Tallarines, fettuccine, gnocchi eaten on the 29th of every month, and sorrentinos, a type of large ravioli, became national dishes. In Australia, post-war Italian immigration transformed the food scene. Over 300,000 Italians immigrated to Australia between 1945 and 1975. The impact on Australian food culture was profound. Before Italian immigration, Australian cuisine was largely Anglo-Celtic: meat pies, fish and chips, roast dinners. Italians introduced espresso coffee, fresh pasta, regional Italian cooking, and a Mediterranean approach to food that emphasized freshness, seasonality, and quality ingredients. Brazil, with its large Italian-speaking population in São Paulo and southern regions, developed its own Italian-Brazilian fusion cuisine. Over 1.5 million Italians immigrated to Brazil, primarily to work in coffee plantations. São Paulo has the largest population of people of Italian descent outside Italy. Brazilian Italian dishes like polenta with chicken and fusilli with calabresa sausage reflect this unique fusion. Canada's Italian communities influenced food culture from Montreal to Toronto to Vancouver. Italian immigration to Canada peaked in the 1950s and 60s. Cities like Toronto's Little Italy became centers of Italian-Canadian culture. Pasta, which had been virtually unknown in English Canada before World War II, became a household staple. By the 1970s and 80s, Italian cuisine had become one of the world's most popular international foods. Italian restaurants existed in virtually every major city on Earth. Pasta was no longer Italian. It was universal. But this globalization had interesting effects. Italian cuisine began to standardize around certain dishes: spaghetti bolognese, carbonara, lasagna, pizza. These became what people worldwide thought of as Italian food, even though they represented a tiny fraction of Italy's diverse culinary traditions. Regional Italian specialties, the orecchietta of Puglia, the bigoli of Veneto, the culurgiones of Sardinia, remained relatively unknown outside Italy. Global Italian cuisine became a simplified, Americanized version of mostly southern Italian dishes. This created some amusing cultural disconnects. In Italy, certain Italian dishes from abroad were completely unknown. Italians visiting America would be confused by spaghetti and meatballs, penny vodka, or Italian dressing. Americans visiting Italy would be disappointed that they couldn't find these dishes. The concept of Italian food had split into two distinct cuisines: authentic Italian cuisine as eaten in Italy, and international Italian cuisine as understood globally. Neither was wrong. They were just different expressions of Italian culinary traditions adapted to different contexts. But Italian immigration and the globalization of pasta also created something beautiful: a worldwide community of people who loved pasta, who found comfort and joy in a simple plate of noodles with sauce, regardless of whether it was authentic or not. Food historians call this culinary creolization, when immigrant foods adapt to new environments and create something new while maintaining connection to their origins. Italian-American food isn't fake Italian food, it's its own legitimate cuisine, born from the immigrant experience. And in the late 20th century, something unexpected happened. Pasta became the foundation for a global food revolution, and cuisines around the world began incorporating pasta in ways that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Let's take a moment to talk about something that doesn't always make it into food history documentaries: the Industrial Revolution that transformed pasta production and made it one of the most affordable foods on Earth. For most of its history, pasta was made by hand, one batch at a time. Even when pasta making became professionalized in medieval Italy, it was still artisanal. Master pasta makers using traditional techniques, bronze dyes, and muscle power to produce pasta in small quantities. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. In the 19th century, engineers began developing machines that could produce pasta on an unprecedented scale. The first major innovation was the continuous press, developed in the 1830s. Previous pasta presses were batch machines. You loaded dough, pressed it, removed the pasta and started over. Continuous presses allowed dough to be fed in one end and pasta to emerge from the other in an unending stream. This increased production capacity by orders of magnitude. A single continuous press could produce more pasta in a day than a dozen traditional pasta makers could produce in a week. The second innovation was mechanical drying. Traditional pasta drying relied on sun and wind, which meant production was weather-dependent and seasonal. Mechanical drying chambers with controlled temperature and humidity allowed pasta to be produced year-round, regardless of weather. The third innovation was the use of Teflon dies in the 1960s. Traditional bronze dies created rough-textured pasta that held sauce well but was slow to produce and required frequent replacement. Teflon dies were faster, more durable, and produced smooth pasta that looked more appealing on the shelf. This caused a controversy that continues to this day. Pasta purists insist that bronze die pasta is superior because its rough texture holds sauce better. Industrial producers argue that Teflon die pasta is more consistent, looks better, and most consumers can't tell the difference.